Hi there, my name's Claudia Havranek and I'm from British Antarctic Survey. Today I'll be talking to you about the fungi of Antarctica. I'm currently stood here in England where we have a temperate climate. This means that we get warm and wet summers and wet and mild winters. All in all, it's a pretty hospitable environment for species to survive. 10,000 miles away in Antarctica, however, temperatures often dip below minus 60 degrees Celsius and wind speeds can exceed 120 miles an hour. Even in this really extreme environment, relatives of these fungi species here still find a way to survive. Today I'll be trying to answer the question, how many fungi are there in Antarctica? I'll be talking to people from the BAS archives, the Bass Herbarium and to BAS scientists to try and answer this question.
So this talk is about Antarctic fungi. But as I talk to my colleagues from British Antarctic Survey, try to have a look out for these 5 things during the talk. A dog called Bodger, trying not to breathe, belly buttons, cosmic dust, and a new species of fungi. So to start with, what is a fungus? In years gone by, before it was easy to use biochemical, molecular, and genetic techniques, we used species' visual characteristics to define what they were. And this led people to think that fungi were part of the group plants. However, we now know that fungi make up their own distinct group. One of the major differences to plants is that fungi cell walls contain a fibrous substance called chitin, and this makes the cells really resilient to extreme environmental pressures, such as extreme heat, cold, and lack of water, some of which you get in Antarctica. Another way fungi are different to plants is that they acquire nutrients by absorbing dissolved molecules, just like animals which eat and dissolve food for nutrients. So this is different to plants which use photosynthesis to get their energy. Fungi secrete digestive enzymes outside into their environment and then absorb the nutrients. Another important characteristic of fungi is that they're immobile except through growth, and this is similar to plants. Fungal spores can travel really long distances though through air or water. In terms of what fungi look like, when I say fungi, you probably think of something like this. And these are mushrooms which are actually just the fruiting body of macroscopic filamentous fungi. But you also get multicellular filamentous molds and single-celled microscopic yeasts which can only be seen through microscopes. So in terms of how fungi look, there's a lot more diversity than just your kitchen mushroom. Another way to address the question, what is a fungus, is to know what species fungi are related to. I've already said that fungi are not part of the group plants. When we look at the species fungi are closest related to, they sit within the domain, which is the highest level of classification, of eukaryotes. And this means that everything within their cells is packaged by membranes, including their genetic information. Fungi then make up their own kingdom within eukaryotes. So they make up their own group just the same way that plants are their own group, animals are their own group, and something called protists are their own group. To start to think about answering the question, how many fungi are there in Antarctica? We can start by more broadly asking the question, how many fungi are there in the world? There are over 144,000 known species of fungi, but we expect there to be a lot more. An estimate in 2017 suggested that there may be between 2.2 and 3.8 million species of fungi. Even if we take a much more conservative estimate, it still seems like there are going to be at least double the number of fungi species as plant species in the world. Fungi are among the most widely distributed organisms on Earth. Many fungi are free-living, so they live on their own in soil or water. Others form parasitic or symbiotic relationships with plants or animals. So there are a lot of places and ways in which these fungi species can live. And because of that, answering the question of how many fungi in the world are there, or how many fungi are there in Antarctica, is a pretty difficult question. In this map of the world, the darker areas show predicted high levels of fungi diversity. This is from a global study published in Nature in 2019. The darker red areas suggest that there'll be high levels of fungal diversity there. However, this global study doesn't even include Antarctica. So trying to answer the question, how many fungi are there in Antarctica, gets pretty difficult, and this paper doesn't help at all. Antarctica is a pretty special place. It's very cold, so you have temperatures below -60 degrees Celsius. It's very windy, so you have wind speeds of over 120 miles per hour. It's also very dry. It's a frozen desert. The amount of snowfall and rainfall we get there is very low. And it's also really, really big. It's 13.8 million kilometres squared. This is 61 times as large as the UK. In terms of reaching Antarctica from the UK, the journey is over 10,000 miles and takes at least 2 days via plane, or if you're taking a ship for part of the journey, it takes significantly longer. So accessing Antarctica is pretty difficult. To try to answer the question, how many fungi are there in Antarctica, we can both look at historical data on fungi which has already been collected and to the scientific research which is currently being undertaken now. I spoke to Alysa Hulbert of the BAS Archives to learn more about what it means to undertake an expedition in Antarctica and about the historical records of fungi in Antarctica.
So Alysa, can you start off by telling us a bit about the BAS Archives?
Yeah, of course. So the British Antarctic Survey Archives is a collection of the institutional records of British Antarctic Survey and its predecessor organisations. So that's going back to Operation Tabarin in the 1940s. So we have about 51,000 items listed in our catalogue, and that includes things that are scientific, administrative, logistical, and historical. So you can think of the archive as the institutional memory of the organisation.
So do you have a favourite item then within this huge collection of the BAS Archives?
Yeah, so that's a really difficult question because there's so much amazing material in here, and depending on my mood, different items speak to me. But I do know what item goes down well with visitors, and that is our dog cards. So we don't have dogs in the Antarctic anymore, but for much of Bass's history, they had sledge dogs for transport, and they needed some way of keeping a record of those dogs and who their parents were and their characteristics and things like that. So I'll just show you here. This is Roger's card, for example. So it's got a little picture of him, so you know what he looks like, and it says about their character. So it says, oh, it's an excellent physique, or timid and snaps.
Earlier in the talk, I mentioned that it takes about 2 days to get down to Antarctica from the UK now. Has that journey to Antarctica changed quite a lot in the past 50 years?
So for much of Bass's history, really until quite recently, people would go down on the ship for the whole way down the Atlantic. So yeah, maybe stopping at Montevideo in Uruguay, or just going straight to the Falklands. And that would take about 6 weeks. And then, yeah, a few more days afterwards to get to the stations. So it's quite amazing, really, how different that is to nowadays, where with modern technology, people can wake up in the UK, in their home, and then within 48 hours be on the Antarctic continent at Rothera.
Wow. So it sounds like historically it's been quite difficult to get down there, and even now it's not the simplest journey. Is there a lot of other preparation and training which goes on before you go on an expedition?
Definitely. There's lots to learn before you go. So, well, first of all, staff have to pass medical and dental checks to see if they're fit and healthy, because obviously it's such a remote place. It could be a 5-hour flight, weather permitting, to get to the nearest hospital in the Falklands or Chile. And then staff who've never been south before will go on maybe 2 weeks of pre-deployment training, where there'll be safety talks and presentations on oil spill response or fire safety, or even tips about photography down there. And that's really useful because it gives people a chance to get to meet the people they're going to be living and working with for sometimes months or even years.
That's a lot of training to undertake before going to Antarctica. Has this always been the case?
So, I mean, it does depend historically what era and also with what discipline, like whether you were a meteorologist or whether you're a general assistant. But definitely a lot of the time people went down with no training and just learn on the job. So this could lead to some scrapes happening. So, for example, one of our most prodigious botanists, Ron Lewis Smith, he was in Antarctica in the 60s, and was heading out to some islands offshore to, you know, see what vegetation was growing there. So he thought, you know, I'd just ski across the sea ice. But he said afterwards, it's one of the most foolish things I've ever done, because halfway across, he noticed that the sea ice was getting really wobbly and getting slush and porridge-like, and his skis were starting to sink under the surface. So he made a U-turn and hightailed it back to his hut on the safety of the island. Thankfully, he made it back to tell the story. Nowadays, obviously, nothing like that would happen. There's so much safety training, and there's trained field guides to help people out as well.
So today we've been talking quite a lot about fungi, and I just wondered, are there any historical records of the fungi collected in Antarctica within the BAS archives?
Yeah, so had a look for our catalogue, see what I could find. So first of all, this is our earliest record of fungi collected down south, and it actually comes from 1944, which dates back to the proper origins of the organisation, because we started with a secret Second World War wartime mission, Operation Tabarin, in 1943. So this is just 1 year later. And we had a botanist in that team who was then known as Ivan Mackenzie Lamb, who was collecting vegetation on the island where the base was and reported collecting I think 2 samples of fungi.
Fungi sound like they're part of BAS's history, really. How did the study of fungi then progress at BAS?
Yeah, so the anecdote I mentioned before from Ron Lewis Smith, he was involved in studies in the 70s on the island of South Georgia, investigating the soil ecology. And one of the ways that you investigate that is by putting strips of cotton into the soil in various locations on the island, and then seeing how fast it decomposes. And those samples were also sent back to Cambridge, where they could be analysed, and they found quite a lot of fungi on those strips. And then getting a bit more recent, so we're talking the 90s, we've got these cool sketches here, and this is from aerobiologist Chad Marshall. So aerobiology, as it sounds, is the study of living organisms that are transported in the air. So that's things like bacteria and viruses, or even algal spores and pollen grains. So they sampled the air in Antarctica for 18 months and then looked at what they'd collected, some of which were fungi, as seen in these images. And then finally, one of the reasons I love working for British Antarctic Survey is that it's multidisciplinary. So you get to get involved in lots of different types of science. So I did find a reference to fungi in the geophysics division notes. So they were looking into cosmic dust in the 50s. So going down, looking in the ice for that, and were surprised to find lots of fungal spores, which they then sent off for mycological analysis.
Wow, Alysa, thank you so much for showing us some of the items from the BAS archives and for teaching us a bit about what it's like to go on an expedition down there. So having spoken to Alysa, it was fascinating to see the historical records of fungi in Antarctica, which are held by BAS. It's become a lot clearer that expeditions to Antarctica require a lot of preparation, travel, and historically can be pretty treacherous undertakings. This goes some way in explaining why there is relatively little research on fungi in Antarctica, and also explains why the fungi of Antarctica are so little known. Having learnt about the historical records of fungi in Antarctica in the BAS archives, earlier this week I had the opportunity to talk to BAS scientist Dr. Kevin Newsham, who's a microbiologist specialising in fungal research. In 2018, Kevin was awarded a Polar Medal for his work on soil and plant ecology in the polar regions. Kevin will be talking about his research and also has something quite special to show us. Okay, so thank you so much for coming to talk to us, Kevin. Could you start out by just telling us a bit about your area of research?
Well, I'm a microbiologist and I work for the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, and specifically I'm a mycologist, so I was trained in the study of fungi. So I study fungi principally that grow in soil, but also other fungi, and maybe I dabble a little bit in plants and other microbes, but specifically my main interest is in fungi.
Can you tell us why the study of fungi in Antarctica is so important?
Fungi hugely important to terrestrial ecosystems. There are several reasons for that, but the fungi that grow in soil have very important roles in the recycling of nutrients. If you can imagine, when a plant or an animal dies and then their tissues go into the soil, those tissues consist of quite complex compounds, and they can't break down without a microbe coming along and sort of dissimilating the tissues, breaking them down, and that in turn releases nutrients into the soil. It's rather like your compost heap in your garden. The fungi are very, very important within that process.
Could you tell us about your research on fungi in Antarctica?
Well, the main reason I'm interested in fungi in Antarctica is, for the reasons I've just explained, they have very important effects on the cycling of nutrients in soils and symbiosis with other organisms like plants and with algae to form lichens. But the Antarctica is warming up very rapidly. So between 1950 and the first few years of this millennium, the Antarctic warmed up in places by about 3 degrees C, which is really quite a rapid rise in temperature. And the research I do tries to discover what the effects of those changes are going to be. So temperatures are going to increase, and there might also be changes in precipitation. And what I do is basically to try and evaluate how that will affect the fungi that grow in the soils, and by inference, how the ecosystems in the Antarctic will respond.
To undertake this research, it sounds like you're going to need to go on quite a few trips down to Antarctica. How many expeditions have you been on, and do you have a favourite place?
Well, I think I've kind of lost count a little bit, but in comparison with some people at BAS, I haven't been south that many times, but I think I've been about 9 times to the Antarctic. One of my favourite places to go to has been South Georgia, which is in the background here. So as you can see, it's a very mountainous landscape, but with a fringe of vegetation that's rich in plants and fungi close to the ocean. And at the other end of the scale, I've also worked at Mars Oasis, which is at about 72 degrees south on Alexander Island, and it's a complete polar opposite of South Georgia in that there's virtually nothing there. It's an event to see something living at that site, but even so, the molecular methods I've used, DNA-based methods, have found about 50 to 80 different species of fungi in the soil there, even though it's completely barren.
Wow, so it sounds like this area is still pretty biodiverse, even though it's so extreme. Probably quite a difficult question to answer, but do you have a favourite Antarctic fungus?
I mean, to me, they're all interesting, but I wouldn't say I have a favourite. I have a bit of a nemesis in that I've been trying to get hold of a fungus called serendipita, which is a symbiotic fungus that grows with liverworts in the Antarctic for many years now. There's one isolate of this fungus or a similar fungus worldwide from the Thar Desert in northern India, and I've tried again and again and again to try and get this fungus into culture. In doing so, if you have a culture of fungus, you can actually do things with it, like inoculate it onto plants to improve their growth. But so far, it's eluded me, I'm afraid.
Antarctica sounds like a very remote place to do fieldwork. Do you think there's still a lot about Antarctic fungi that we don't know?
And it's a inhospitable place. It's difficult to get to and remote. So one can undoubtedly make new discoveries there. A good example of that is the discovery of new species. So we have here a species of fungus that's come from the roots of a plant at 67 degrees south, grown in culture on an agar medium. And this is probably, almost certainly, a new species. What one can do is to take the hyphae of the fungus, extract the DNA, and then run the sequence of the DNA against publicly available databases. And this doesn't come out as being in the database. So my colleagues and I think it's almost certainly a new species. So it's just a small example that if you put effort into researching remote regions, then you like to make new discoveries.
Wow, so that's amazing that you found a whole new species. Is there anything distinctive or important about that species?
Yeah, if you take this fungus and you inoculate it into sterile soil from an Antarctic island where it's isolated, it respires. It breaks down the carbon in the soil, and it will release the carbon into the atmosphere. And if you get enough of that carbon dioxide that it's respiring away from the soil, the same as we respire CO2 from our lungs, you can date it, and it's aged to about 1100 years of age. So I think that's approximately when Alfred the Great was around. So it's pretty incredible. The carbon that's fixed by the plants from the atmosphere is released at that time, about 1100 years ago. It's released then into the atmosphere by the fungus. So it's got implications for what happens with climate change in the Antarctic. You know, as the environment warms up and organisms like this become more active in the soil, that's the kind of effect that it's going to have.
Look forward to reading about that when the research comes out. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, Kevin.
Speaking to Kevin, it's really clear the more expeditions scientists go on, the more there will be discovered in Antarctica. The remoteness and vastness of the place make it a difficult place to undertake expeditions, but with new species to be found, it seems like it's well worth it. After scientists return to BAS, the UK Polar Data Centre, part of BAS, manages the data collected. Ensuring Antarctic data is well preserved and openly available is essential to supporting scientific research and discoveries as part of the Antarctic research community. The data held includes physical fungi specimens collected by scientists, as well as digital datasets. After going on an expedition, scientists can deposit fungi specimens in the Bass Herbarium. As the Bass collection isn't that large, specimens of dried plants, mosses, lichens and fungi are all kept together in the herbarium, rather than having a separate collection of fungi specimens. If we did, that would be called a fungarium. A herbarium is like a library for plants. Dried specimens can be deposited in the herbarium, and then there's an online catalogue for scientists to look at and take out specimens to use for their research on loan, just like a library book. The Bass Herbarium is the largest single collection of Antarctic plants, fungi, lichens and mosses, with around 40,000 specimens. The collection was established in 1969, and the makeup of the collection reflects the makeup of flora and species you get within the region. So there are a lot of lichens and mosses and very few vascular or flowering plants. In fact, due to the harsh conditions in Antarctica, there are only 2 species of vascular plants known to survive there. Earlier this week, I had the chance to call Mari Whitelaw, one of the herbarium managers at BAS, to be shown some of the collection.
So what can you tell me about the fungi within the collection?
So we have about 300 fungi specimens here at BAS. The earliest fungi that we have a few from 1928, but those are really outliers. The collection really starts from the 1960s onwards.
Wow, so it sounds like you've got quite a few different specimens within the herbarium. In terms of scientific research, what can these be used for?
So The uses are quite wide-ranging. Originally, specimens would have been deposited in herbaria mostly for identification purposes and for looking at taxonomy. So people identifying new specimens and then comparing what they brought back to the specimens in the herbarium to check their identifications. Today we do that more with DNA, so people use molecular methods, and they'll come back to herbaria to look at old specimens, try and extract some DNA to see how different plants and fungi are related to each other. More recently, people can look at things like the effects of climate change on, for example, the geographical range of plants. So you can look at herbaria and say where these plants were collected in the past, and now we might not be finding them there anymore. We might be finding them hopefully different places. And people have even looked at whether the climate has been changing the morphology. That's how the plants or fungi look of the species.
Do we know what all the specimens in the collection are?
We have, as I said, about 300 specimens, and about 50 of those haven't been identified. So they're in their database as fungus to indicate that they don't have a name. But of the ones that we have identified, the most common one in the collection, or the one that we have most examples of, is something called Fungi of Antarctica. I'll try and show you this here. So we have 27 specimens in the collection, and they come from various subantarctic islands, such as South Georgia and Sydney, and a few come from the Antarctic Peninsula. The name, this really pleases me, the name Omphalina comes from the ancient Greek word for navel or belly button, and it's because the caps of the mushroom, when they're not dried like I've just shown you, but when they're still alive, sit up like this, looking a bit like a belly button.
Do you have any specimens from Antarctica which we can see?
Luckily, Claudia, I do. We're in the right place for that. So this is actually one of the few fungal specimens from the continent itself. It's from an area called Edmondson Point, which is in Victoria Land. Now, what we can see here is the fungi specimen itself, which actually hasn't been identified, is this little colony right in the middle here, and it's living on a colony of moss. Incidentally, the moss it's living on is called Bryum argentum, and that's one of the species that you can find in the UK as well as in Antarctica. It's one of the ones that you'll see between cracks in the pavement. It'll look sort of slightly silvery greenish coloured, which I find very pleasing. We also have a specimen here. Now this one's interesting because we think of Antarctica as a very cold place, but there are actually places where there is some volcanic activity, and the hot gases coming up through the ground creates these areas called fumaroles, and these can be very nice for small plants and fungi to live. So this species here, there we go, is a little Geronima. It's a really lovely little specimen, isn't it? Delicate looking. Other areas that are good for plant and fungi life are around animal colonies. Lots of Antarctica doesn't have very high levels of nutrients, and there's a obvious source of nutrients for them around where the animals and birds hang out. So we've got this little Scutellinia. Can you see this? So again, it's on a colony of moss, and right in the center there's a little orange dot, and that is the Scutellinia. Now I've got one final specimen to show you here. It's in this packet here. It's an Epibryon. So I've shown you some of the larger mushroom forming specimens. This is something a bit different, so I'm going to open this packet. It contains another packet. Which contains another packet. Which contains a large number, you see those, of really small packets. I'm going to very carefully open one of these. I'm a bit nervous, so I'm going to try not to breathe on it. Okay. And here, inside this, we have an absolutely tiny specimen. And even then, that's not actually the specimen of fungi that we're looking at. So the term epi means on or upon. So if a plant is an epiphyte, it means that it lives on another plant. And that's the sort of fungi that this is. So what we can see here is the bryophyte leaf, the moss leaf, that the fungi was actually living on. but we need a microscope to see the fungi itself.
And how about answering the question, how many fungi are there in Antarctica?
It's a good question. From the herbaria, we could certainly say the number of fungi that we have from Antarctica. We can also have a look at the maps and see where we haven't been to collect before. So we can have a look at the areas where perhaps if people were to go on collecting trips in the future, we could send people where presumably there would be a lot more species that we don't know about. So I think we can give you a perhaps baseline number, but not a potential number.
Seeing the variety of specimens held in the Bass Herbarium really highlights how different the fungi found in Antarctica can be, both compared to what we have in the UK and within Antarctica itself. The diversity in the way fungi specimens in Antarctica look really highlights the diversity of life in Antarctica and what we can expect to find there in the future. So whilst we haven't been able to answer the question, how many fungi are there in Antarctica, you should now have a good understanding of what a fungus is, how the study of them in Antarctica is becoming increasingly important, and have had a nice look at all the fungi specimens held in the Bass Herbarium. I hope that you managed to notice the following during the talk. Alysa in the archives showed us the dog tag of the dog called Bodger, who was a Bass dog. Bass doesn't have these companions anymore on expeditions, which is just one way in which Antarctic expeditions has changed in recent years. Throughout the talk, we saw examples of different forms fungi can take. Mari showed us a moss leaf on which a microscopic fungi lives on and tried not to breathe on it so it didn't get blown away when she was showing us. Fungi come in different forms, and like in the case of this specimen, there are many fungi that you can't see without a microscope. In the herbarium, Mari showed us a mushroom of a fungi species called Umphalina antarctica, which means belly button in Greek. Alysa told us about an expedition in the 1950s which set out to find cosmic dust, but instead found fungal spores in the ice of Antarctica. This is just one example of how multidisciplinary Antarctic science is. And finally, Kevin Newsham showed us what he thinks is probably a new species of fungi found in Antarctica. This, amongst other discoveries of new fungi species, suggests that there are still a lot of new species to be found in Antarctica, so we're on our way to finding out how many species there are, but we're not there yet. Thank you for listening to this talk. If you're interested in learning more about the data held by the UK Polar Data Centre, including the Bass Herbarium, take a look on the BAS webpage.